Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 213, The Russian-Ukrainian Crisis. As you may have guessed, some listeners and family members and friends have requested my opinion about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. While it really isn't a historical question, and this is a historical podcast, I felt that it is an important issue to cover. I hope that my thoughts will give you better understanding of what's happening and clarify the muddled messages presented by the media and the propaganda machine in Russia. Having said that, my opinion may make me a target of the Russian leader. However, I'm hoping that I'll kind of fly under the radar. Let's begin with a recent statement made by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Quote, "Modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia, more specifically, the Bolshevik Communist Russia. This process began practically immediately after the 1917 revolution. Moreover, Lenin and his associates did it in the sloppiest way in relation to Russia, by dividing, tearing from her pieces of our own historical territory. In my opinion, this is utter revisionist nonsense. Ukraine was where Russia got its start, and in particular, their capital, Kyiv. Putin treats Ukraine now as a child of Russia, whereas it's really more like a sibling or an uncle. Almost all Ukrainians speak Russian, although the latest statistics I've seen is that 75% view Ukrainian as their native language, while the remaining 25% said it was Russian. Still, there is a profound feeling of nationalist pride in being Ukrainian. This feeling is so strong that when he was in power, Joseph Stalin felt that it needed suppression. And I'll cover this later in this episode. My primary sources of information about Ukraine is from the book Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine by Anna Reid, along with the writings of Anne Applebaum, author of Twilight of Democracy and Red Famine, as well as the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Gulag, A History. I've also delved into my extensive library on Russia and Ukraine. Kyiv has a hazy early history, as it traditionally marks its founding in the year 482 AD. It became the seat of the people known as the Rus in the 9th century. There was no Russia at this time, and Moscow was a forest. And don't even get into St. Petersburg, that would come way later. After the Mongol invasion, though, it would not become a town of note, this is Moscow, until the 13th century. Kyiv would become the capital of the Rus lands in 882, taking that away from Novgorod. Around the year 1100, it had a population estimated at 100,000, one of the largest in Europe, far greater than Paris even. They were the most powerful city-state of this period of Russian history, and would also be the high point in the early history of the people known as the Rus. Kyiv was heavily damaged during its first sacking in 1169 by Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky, the Grand Prince of Vladimir Suzdal, who reigned from 1157 until he died in 1174. The final complete destruction of the city was accomplished by the Mongol invasion. This final destruction took place between November 28th and December 6th, 1240. Almost every man, woman, child, and animal would be slaughtered. Kyiv would not recover its population for centuries thereafter. So, Putin wants you to believe that Ukraine was wholly dependent on Russia and didn't exist until the Bolsheviks made it so after the 1917 Russian Revolution. Well, he would, of course, need to magically erase both the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav, which brought Ukraine under the protection of Russia, and the 1667 Treaty of Andrusovo, which gave Ukraine some level of self-determination. Ukraine was forced to cede its independence to Russia due to threats from Poland in the mid to late 17th century. One of the main reasons was based on whose church Ukrainians would follow, the Catholic Poles or the Orthodox Russians. So naturally, they would choose the latter. This would be a tragic decision in some ways, as there would be another 30 years of war crisscrossing the Ukrainian and Polish landscape. The Poles would call this the deluge, while the Ukrainians would dub it the ruin. In 1686, the Russians and Poles signed a so-called Eternal Peace Treaty without consulting the Ukrainians or the Cossacks, who nominally led their people. For the next 350 years, Russia would lord over Ukraine. Still, the Ukrainians never gave up on their independence, believing themselves a sovereign people, as many other parts of the Russian Empire did. Well, moving forward in time to the Russian Revolution and the founding of the USSR, we see a feint of independence given to Ukraine with the formation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was initially formed in 1919 and then had a minor change in 1934. This is what Putin claims was the founding of Ukraine, but as you've just heard, that is frankly not true. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was a great fear in the West that the Ukrainian-held nuclear arsenal, numbering about 1,900 missiles, would fall into the wrong hands. To put that into perspective, that dwarfs the number of atomic weapons that China now possesses, and was the third largest stockpile at that time. With the instability of the new independent republics post-Soviet Union breakup, the West was understandably nervous. The Bush administration and subsequently the Clinton administration began to debate a solution to these concerns. The British, Russians, and the United States began negotiations to transfer these weapons over to Russia to allay these fears. On December 5, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, a series of documents referring to 3 identical political agreements, was signed. It was intended to provide security assurances by its signatories relating to Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine's accession to the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty. In addition, there are major assurances made by Russia that it would respect the sovereignty of Ukraine in return for its stockpile of nuclear weapons. Have you heard anything coming from Putin that acknowledges this agreement? Of course not, because in his mind, he didn't sign it. In reality, Putin does not believe in respecting treaties if it so suits him. We really have to understand who Putin's mentor was. It was a man named Yuri Andropov, who led the Soviet Union from 1982 to 1984. More importantly, he was the Soviet ambassador to Hungary from 1954 to 1957. During that time, he was involved in the violent repression of the 1956 Hungarian uprising. After being named as the head of the KGB in 1957, he would lead a renewed suppression of dissent in the USSR and throughout the Warsaw Bloc nations. It was a suppression not seen since the great purges of Joseph Stalin in the late 1930s. If you were a dissenter, he thought you were mentally ill, and they would send them to mental hospitals. Now, this brutal man would mold the young mind of Vladimir Putin. Putin, it seems, was deeply scarred by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There are many, some of whom I've personally communicated with, who had been once in close contact with him in the past, that believe that his goal is to return Russia to the glory days not of the empire, but of the USSR. This has been seen time and time again. Examples include the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It's important to see another side to the Russian treatment of Ukraine, the time when Stalin ruled over the Soviet Union. One of the great tragedies of the 20th century occurred in Ukraine. It is known as the Holodomor, where an estimated 3.5 million Ukrainians died of starvation and disease. In 1932, one of Stalin's henchmen, Clement Voroshilov, toured Ukraine and was appalled to see the fields of one of the richest soils in Europe filled with weeds instead of crops to feed the Soviet people. The problem was the forced collectivization of the farms, the mass deportations and arrests of many Ukrainians led to what Sheila Fitzpatrick describes in her book On Stalin's Team, quote, Stalin had his own version of what was happening. The peasants were staging a go-slow strike, issuing a political challenge to the regime that was no less dangerous because it avoided an open revolt. Fitzpatrick went further on to write about what Stalin thought was happening. Quote, this notion of pretending was taken up by the press, which ran some extraordinary stories about peasants staging a famine, acting the part of victims, even starving their families to make propaganda. Putin is already using this type of false news to justify his actions. What Stalin saw in 1932 is what I imagine Putin is seeing in 2022. He sees a political challenge to his regime, a dangerous threat without an open revolt. What Stalin did was to punish this challenge via a genocidal decision. He would starve the Ukrainian people to death. Stalin also purged the Communist Party of anyone who didn't back his lies. Tens of thousands of these people would die as well. Putin has decided to attack the people with this invasion, not caring what the rest of the world thinks. Stalin was, if nothing else, quite a bit stealthier in the way he handled his enemies. He duped many in the West, believing his preposterous lies. An example would be New York Times reporter William Durante, who helped spread the news that Stalin was putting out there. Durante's harshest critics today have demanded that his Pulitzer Prize be revoked, even though he died in 1957. One similarity between the two events is that both were surrounded by the big lie. Putin swore that he would not invade and is telling his people that this is just a strategic military action, or that he's removing pro-Nazi fascists from the Ukrainian government. As I just explained, Stalin refused to even acknowledge that a famine was even occurring. If they were going hungry in his mind, it was their own doing. The word famine was not even allowed to be mentioned during the height of the crisis in 1933, not even in the meetings of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. When we look back in history, authoritarian regimes need to lie to stay in power. This is one of the few things in history that I've seen that's relatively constant. Putin and Stalin are experts and were experts at it, as were Hitler and Mussolini. The list goes on and on. The list is so long that one day I can imagine a podcaster doing an entire series on those purveyors of the big lies of history. As I sit here on March 3rd, 2022, the situation in Ukraine is dire, to say the least. Vladimir Putin really doesn't care what we think of him. As a matter of fact, his being untrustworthy, as Anne Applebaum put it in her review of the situation in a recent edition of the online magazine The Atlantic, is that, quote, lying keeps opponents on their toes. Nor does Lavrov, who's the foreign minister of Russia, mind if he's hated, because hatred gives him an aura of power. Think about this very carefully. Lying and being hated is power in Putin's mind. This is the message that he is sharing with those he considers allies. I'm not going to name names, but I don't think you need to stretch your imagination very far to find contemporary examples. But I suggest that you spread your field of vision across the globe, as this type of authoritarian lying behavior is not just occurring in a country or two. It is beginning to spread. According to despots and those who want dictatorial power, lying to the people and having people hate you isn't a bad thing. Applebaum further points out that Putin doesn't care about prosperity in Russia. He cares about remaining in power. She tells us that the West has lacked a proper response to the Russian leaders' constant breaking of international laws. Why haven't he not stopped their money laundering? Their donations of money to political campaigns in France, much less in the US. How about Germany's dependence on Russian oil, which is another example of not taking things seriously? The Russian oligarchs who support Putin have a history of buying properties in Miami and New York at above market value to launder their money. They've been doing this around the world. They've been stealing from the Russian people and depositing their ill-gotten gains in banks in Cyprus and Switzerland, to name a few. Well, just recently, the Swiss have already announced plans to end that scam. Further irony, the Taliban has already called for a peace agreement to be reached between the two sides. When you lose one of the most violent and non-violent governments in the world, you've genuinely lost the gambit. On March 2nd, China switched from being all pro-Russia to being neutral. How much further will they drift is anyone's guess. Regarding China, they certainly have their eyes on Taiwan. Everyone knows it if they're being honest. However, this invasion of Ukraine and the world's reaction to it may have set that possibility back 5 to 10 years. I cannot imagine how angry that would make Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. To top it off, Ukraine is an important trading partner with China. China was their largest trading partner with a turnover of around $15.4 billion US in 2020, 7.1 billion going from Ukraine to their Asian customer. There is also growing pressure on the oligarchs of Russia, as evidenced by the negotiations now underway between billionaire Roman Abramovich to sell his ownership of the English Premier League soccer team Chelsea, according to ESPN.com. In addition, there are rumors that he's also trying to unload a number of his properties in the UK because of fears that his assets will be frozen. One question I haven't answered yet that I'd like to address now is, what got us to this point? Did the West underestimate Putin? Did they make missteps that led to this tragic crisis? The answer is absolutely yes. The Russo-Georgian War of 2008 should have been a major wake-up call to the West. Instead of standing up to the Russians in the strongest way possible, they tried to negotiate using diplomacy. U.S. President at the time was George W. Bush, but he was in his last year as he could no longer run again. He laid the groundwork for the weak response, which unfortunately was carried onward by his successor, Barack Obama. The Crimean takeover in 2014 was met with strong words, condemnations, and, in my opinion, ineffective economic sanctions. It was a failure and is one of the reasons we're in this pickle. One incident in particular that sits in my mind as to how the West and the U.S. in particular misunderstood their relationship with Russia was during the presidential debate between Republican candidate Mitt Romney and President Obama in 2012. Romney said, quote, "This is to Russia. This is, without question, our number one geopolitical foe. They fight causes for the world's worst actors. The idea that President Obama has some more flexibility in mind for Russia is very, very troubling indeed." To which President Obama replied, quote, "The 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because, The Cold War has been over for 20 years. It was a comment I'm sure past president regrets. What I'm not going to do right now is much of a discussion about past President Trump and his relationship with Vladimir Putin. There are so many things that we don't know that it shadows many of the things that we do know. Trump has heaped lavish praise on the Russian leader, and when he was president, he even trusted him more than the U.S. intelligence community, which, in the weeks coming up to the invasion, were spot on. They predicted that Putin would invade, while many others, including myself, saw there's no logical reason for this to happen. I doubt it. And I was wrong, as were many of the other pundits and so-called experts. Praising Putin after he attacked Ukraine has emboldened him. The last thing we need to send to Russia is mixed messages, as they relish in the chaos they believe that they have created. Before I go any further, though, I do have to explain that the Crimean takeover was a very different beast than what happened in Georgia and the present situation in Ukraine. Crimea was a territory of Russia for centuries. It was captured from the Crimean Tatars, an offshoot of the Mongols and their successors, the Golden Horde. Imperial Russia annexed the Crimean Khanate in 1783 under the reign of Catherine the Great. The Crimean Tatars raided Russian and Ukrainian lands, captured their residents, and sold them into slavery for centuries. A major war between Russia and a coalition of Great Britain, France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire was fought between 1853 and 1856. It was known as the Crimean War. The Russians lost almost 450,000 men to the conflict. Still, it remained part of the Russian Empire and was part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or RSFSR, until Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to hand it over to Ukraine as, quote, unquote, a gift of appreciation. It really meant nothing at the time because Ukraine and Russia were not really autonomous, as they were part of the greater USSR. It would only come into play after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, in some sense, Crimea wasn't really Ukrainian as it was Russian in a historical sense. The debate on whether Putin had a solid case to take Crimea by force is something that I'll hopefully cover in a future episode. So the big question is, what do I think the outcome of this crisis will be? Boy, do I ever wish I could come up with something that sounds reasonable and logical, but I don't know if that is entirely possible at this point. Will Putin back down because of the West's pressure on him? Now, you can throw that one out the window right away. He is a dictatorial strongman with an immense ego that has been dealt blows when the old Soviet Union collapsed. But I also think that there was something wrong with him health-wise. There is speculation that Putin was treated for cancer in 2020, but even more importantly, that he may have Parkinson's disease. The Kremlin, of course, has denied that in an eerily familiar proclamation. They said that he's in the best health of anyone. This is the field that I work in, the field of health. And I got to tell you, Putin of 2022 does not look like the same man of 2018. So there is some possibilities here. But then again, this is rumor. I can't verify this, but it does look rather compelling that something is going on. But if this is the case, it would be the worst case scenario. Putin might want revenge and may just want to blow the whole thing up without any concern about collateral damage. Still, this is another possibility that is less likely than others. I just hope I'm right with that guess. What we really do have to understand is that the Russians and Putin, with his cronies, are diametrically opposed to having NATO sitting on their doorstep. And frankly, I fully agree. Embedded into the Russian psyche is the knowledge of a history of invasions. The Mongols from the east, the Swedes under Charles XII, Poles, French under Napoleon, the Germans under Hitler, from the west, just to name a few, have crossed borders into Russia. Some were more successful than others. The threat that Ukraine could possibly join an enemy like NATO is a bridge too far for Putin. It would be absolutely unacceptable. There is a way out of this dilemma. After World War II, there was a country not too far from the Russian border that the West and Stalin haggled over. Stalin wanted the whole eastern part of Europe, while the West was pretty adamant that this wouldn't happen. After Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev took over the negotiations, reaching a compromise. In 1955, the Soviets pulled out of Austria after a constitutional guarantee of neutrality was given to the USSR, and it still exists to this day. On the other hand, the Ukrainians might not be amenable to such an arrangement, given that the Russians have already backed out of the Budapest Memorandum. Moreover, Putin is a purveyor of numerous big lies, so what would stop him from reneging on yet another treaty or agreement? Also, the Ukrainians may be so angry and hardened by the loss of civilian lives that they may not have the stomach for this kind of settlement. Something has to give. The Ukrainians don't have the firepower to hold off the Russian military indefinitely, although it's looking pretty decent right now. From what I've been hearing, they're not getting in as fast as they expected to. But conversely, the Russian people may not have the will to put up with the loss of their sons in a war that may drag on for weeks, months, or even years. We must remember Afghanistan. People had lost their stomach for that one. Russia, in my opinion, does not have the ability to occupy the whole of Ukraine for any period of time. Add to the misery, the economic collapse already happening in Russia may be too much for the people to withstand, even the more conservative backers of Putin. And there is a lot of groundswell that I've been hearing underground that the people are pretty much fed up with Putin's autocratic regime. However, the Russian people are hearing the same old tired line that the Soviet leadership piled on them in the past. It isn't our fault that the bread lines are long, or you can't get those items you need or want. It's the West's fault. That line might have worked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it got out of the bag a long time ago. There are enough people in Russia who know the truth. They've been allowed to travel. They've seen the West, and they've talked to their friends there. Ignorance was a virtue back in the old Soviet days. The communist leadership counted on it. Putin can't count on it anymore. He may and is trying to intimidate the people with arrests and torture. Still, there is a limit that I believe he is approaching. When do the people doing the actual oppression of their own begin to question their orders and reject them? It happened in the late 1980s in the Eastern Bloc nations, so we have a historical precedent. Back in 1976, my Russian history professor, Dr. Paul Avrich, predicted the end of the Soviet Union within 25 years. Of course, we all thought that he was a bit nuts. But, as you know, he wasn't. He was spot on. What ended the USSR was the economy. They ran out of money, and they had no way to continue to spend on their military or on consumer goods for the people. I can see the very same thing happening once again, only this time in a much shorter time frame. We're already seeing the pressure the world's governments are putting on the oligarchs in Russia. One had his yacht seized by the Germans already. Another raced his luxury boat to the Seychelles in order to hide it. It's only a matter of time before more and more of their worldwide assets are frozen, leaving them with nothing except worthless rubles. How long would they be willing to continue with this power grab. The coming days will tell us a lot about where this conflict is heading. My hope is that it will not expand and that the already tragic losses of life on both sides will abate. My heart goes out to the Ukrainian people. If things change, I will be here to share my opinions with my listeners. As I might have told you in my last little snippet earlier this week, I'm closing up shop on the Patreon version of the Russian History Podcast and renewing my commitment to this one free of charge. It was a difficult decision, but I had to be fair to my Patreon supporters as I've been under increasing pressure in my career to not be able to put any consistent amount of episodes out there. But I am committed to putting out more episodes in this, the Russian History Retold podcast for free. So, as always, до свидания и спасибо большое.